Do you want to get into PC gaming for under 500 bucks and still have good performance at 1080p? Well, if so, then today's build is going to be one of the best looking PCs that you can get out there on the market. And I'm not talking about the looks of the PC, I'm talking about the price performance, where what we're doing here is going with a typical office style PC that has really good specs and actually has the potential to just add in a graphics card, and then from there you can extract so much value. And that's exactly what we've got here, where on a used parts hunt we picked up an i7 7700 system with a cooler, 32 gigabytes of RAM, 450 watt power supply, 250 gigabyte SSD, 1 terabyte hard drive. It also had a front and rear 120mm fans. So all we have to do here is add in a potential candidate graphics card. Now we're going with none other than the RX 6600. Well, we picked this up on a deals hunt for around $250 US. Now, at this point in time of making this video, you can actually pick these GPUs up for relatively good prices, if not even better than what I got on the used market. So the whole PC, the build here, comes in under $500. Though the first thing you may be wondering is that 450 watt power supply going to be okay? And here's where I recently did a build with my son where we ended up getting an RTX 2080 and latest 12th gen system to run at roughly 210 watts after we undervolted the system. So don't worry too much about the power supply, in the sense that just make sure if you've got a power supply and that it's from a decent brand and it can actually deliver the power that it says so on the label. So I think for mid-range components like the RX 6600 and the i7 7700, we should be okay with 450 watts available, but there's only one way to find out, and that is to test this thing and put it through its paces.
Never pay full price for Windows 10 or 11 again. With today's video sponsor SCD Keys, you can get activated for as little as $15 using that coupon BFTYC. Links in the description below.
So now we've finished all the results, we can lay this one out with our budget gaming PC here, the RX 6600 and i7 7700 versus the 6700 XT and Ryzen 5 5500. I'm going to throw this build in the mix just to show you the value differential here, but also it does show that a Ryzen 5 5500 and a 6700 XT is actually a pretty great combo, where I'll be throwing in the smart access memory benchmarks that we did too. So first up here, we've got Borderlands 3, where we had 69 average FPS versus 107. Now 1% lows were decent on both systems, and then the 0.1% lows sucked on both systems. And every single setup that I've tried in Borderlands 3 on ultra settings always tends to get a weird spike, and the 0.1% lows reflect that. So when that happens, that basically points towards the game engine itself. So another title that we'll pull up next is Fortnite. This does tend to happen quite a bit on Fortnite, where we had here smart access memory actually pulling off a smoother benchmark. But even then, if I do play a full round of Fortnite for say 20 minutes, I will get a spike even with smart access memory enabled. Now, the funny thing about Fortnite is you'll notice the difference here is actually a lot larger than Borderlands 3. So the i7 7700 is actually starting to meet a bit of a bottleneck at 1080p compared to at least Borderlands 3, and of course compared to the Ryzen 5 5500 and 6700 XT. Now moving on to Apex Legends, here is where we had 130 average FPS, and the 1% lows were pretty good, but the 0.1% lows were lackluster, and this is compared with the 215 average FPS and 143 and 137, 1% and 0.1% lows. Then the last game we had here was Total War, and here's where we saw a bit of a different result, where we got 108 average FPS versus 108 average FPS, both on ultra settings. And then the smart access memory, of course, allowed the Ryzen 5 5500 system to get a substantial boost. So after looking at those gaming numbers, the results were actually different to what I expected, where some titles were actually in favor of the RX 6600 being better value, then some titles had the 6700 XT with the Ryzen 5 5500 just pulling out really far ahead. And this is where I'm going to actually pay particular attention, rather than looking at the RX 6600 and RX 6700 XTs individually, where we've done separate reviews on them. I would be looking more so at this i7 7700, where I was actually kind of disappointed with its performance coupled with the RX 6600, in that I feel like if you're going with these older CPUs and you're coupling it with a newer graphics card, an RX 6000 series or a RTX 3000 series card, then you'll definitely want to look at least, at the very least, getting, say, a Z200 series motherboard, where in this case, our H270 motherboard wouldn't take the DDR4 memory over 2400 megahertz. That was the theoretical limit. And that sort of reminded me, wow, man, Intel kind of really used to make their hardware suck if you weren't paying the extra money. Where at 2400 megahertz, you are very limited for DDR4, especially when a lot of the DDR4 memory available nowadays is just budget and it's 3200 megahertz. So with this older gear, at least the DDR4 stuff with the i7, you are getting let down by the actual memory itself, where I would much rather, if you're in the market for some older gear, go with, say, some of the Xeons on DDR3, where you can get quad channel DDR3, which is even cheaper than DDR4, or you can get, say, an 5820K on X99, and they are going to perform a lot better, I believe, in modern titles than the i7-7700 will. Though if you do want to go with an i7-6700 or an i7-7700, which is what we had here today, I would look at what perhaps you can get one of those Z motherboards for versus an H or a B250, for example, where I just saw the performance here was just kind of lackluster. As for the i7-7700, if you guys look through the history of my channel, I really haven't done a whole lot of content with this CPU or the i7-6700, as when I look at it, the performance, especially versus the price, you're not really getting a good deal. And so I'd say for this CPU right here, coupled with an RX 6600, it's the limit, especially with 2400 megahertz memory. But going any higher than that, I would seriously want to upgrade the CPU or even just get an alternative platform like we said before, 5820K or maybe something like a 1680 V2 or V3 Xeon, and you'd be having a much better experience with the RX 6600. Though with those negatives out of the way, it's time to look at the positives with a build like this. And the first being, as we talked about with that 450 watt power supply, it actually wasn't a problem at all. Out of the box with these two components, we had 250 watts max power consumption, but then when we undervolted the i7-7700, we gave that minus 70 millivolts in the BIOS, and it still ran at the same speeds absolutely fine. And then we also undervolted the GPU. We saw the power consumption drop from the wall down to around 160 watts while we're running Unigine Heaven. So that's a massive drop in power consumption. And you can see here with the 450 watt power supply, that's going to do an absolutely fine job, even when we weren't undervolting with running these two components. So when it comes to power supplies, don't be too afraid to go with a decent 500 watt, especially on a mid-range build. Though that said, if you are really worried about if your power supply is good enough, where I get asked this question actually locally a lot, what power supply do I need? Don't be afraid to go out and get a cheap water meter and then find out how much your system is drawing. Where in the past we've done a video with a 450 watt power supply, a budget entry-level power supply, and it actually performed really well. I was actually shocked at what you could get even out of a 450 watt. The last little positive to look at with this build was Windows 10 Home was already pre-activated. So what I did was I installed Windows 10 Pro initially, and that was saying it was unactivated. Then I installed Windows 10 Home, and that was activated and all good to go. So if you do buy a used PC and it's not activated on Windows, you can perhaps try installing a different version of Windows, whether it's Home or Pro or something else, and then from there you can see if it's activated. In this case, that did save us about $14 US. Anyhow, guys, I hope you enjoyed today's budget gaming PC. In terms of the RX 6600, I like it. In terms of the i7-7700, not so much. I thought I'd give it a try because the whole build itself was actually coming in with a pretty decent price with 32 gigabytes of memory installed. So I thought in terms of specs, it looked pretty good, but then in terms of just using it in the real world, there was that limitation, especially with that 2400 megahertz limit on the actual motherboard itself. Anyway, guys, with that aside, I hope you enjoyed today's video. If you did, then be sure, as always, hit that like button for us, and also let us know in the comment section below, have you tried an i7-7700, i7-6700? What are your thoughts and opinions on these CPUs? Personally, I just feel like avoiding them. I don't feel like they offer a massive benefit, especially over the 4790, for example, and I feel like they're much more expensive, where the motherboards are an absolute pain, where Intel locked down pretty much most of the motherboards except for the Z series. So that was sort of like a reminder of not to go with 6th and 7th gen on the mainstream. But if you guys have different thoughts, love reading them, just like this question of the day here, which comes from Knockdown Bow 897, and they ask, who do I need to talk to for a $20 PC, and how much for a PC that can run Warframe? So Warframe is actually quite a easy game to run on PC, but you could probably make a $20 PC happen depending on where you live, and if you live close to either a recycling yard or if you're on a marketplace locally, whether it's Facebook Marketplace or I think in the US they have OfferUp and stuff like that. You can use these marketplaces to see if the used market for PC parts is booming. And if it is, you can sit on there and wait for a bargain to pop up. And so that would be my recommendation for doing that. As for me living in Japan, it's definitely a lot different, the game here, than it is in Australia. I'm having a tougher time here, definitely, especially on the real cheap stuff and low-end stuff, where a lot of people won't even want to sell that stuff. They'll just go dump it off at a hard off and stuff, and then these recycling places will get the stuff and then charge way too much for it. Where in Australia, I had different avenues for getting really cheap builds going. Though of course, I'm still on the prowl for those really cheap PCs, and perhaps maybe a Warframe PC might be hitting your sub boxes very soon. And with that aside, I'll catch you guys in another tech video very soon. Peace out for now. Bye.